Hello and welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester, I'm the Director of Hammer's Public Programs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our lecture series, Rembrandt Here and Now. Today is the fourth lecture on the artist Rembrandt van Rijn by art historian John Walsh. In this series of 6 talks, Walsh is discussing Rembrandt's drawings, paintings, and etchings with a focus on works that are in Southern California museum collections, including the Hammer Museum. I want to say that not only are we honored to have persuaded John Walsh to give this thorough and insightful series of talks, we're especially thrilled at the global audience that has gathered each Sunday to listen to them. Last week, we had audience members watching from 21 countries: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, Indonesia, Ireland, Israel, Japan, Kenya, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Pakistan, Panama, Poland, Portugal, Serbia, Switzerland, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and of course, the United States. Somehow I find it very hopeful that in these crazy times of pandemics and upheaval, that we all still find a way to come together as a human family around the world. So a shout out to all of you watching wherever you are, and welcome. Now I want to introduce our wonderful guest presenter, John Walsh. Walsh is a renowned independent art historian. He was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000. After graduating from Yale University and getting his PhD from Columbia, he worked as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he taught art history at Columbia and Harvard. Since he left the Getty, he's been teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there and at the Hammer Museum. Last fall, he gave a 3-part series at the Hammer on Vincent van Gogh, which is available on the Hammer website, and I highly recommend it. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch paintings of the 17th century and of several books, including the J. Paul Getty Museum and its collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Hammer Museum and of the Yale University Art Gallery. Today's talk will focus on Rembrandt's self-portraits. Rembrandt made hundreds of self-portraits in his lifetime, prompting much speculation by art historians over the years, and John Walsh is going to guide us through many of them and talk about Rembrandt's motives as well as his techniques. Next Sunday, Walsh will talk about Rembrandt's later years. In the late 1650s, Rembrandt was painting many commissioned portraits of patrons and officials, as well as of classical heroes, gods, and saints, including the Hammer Museum's own spectacular portrait of the Roman goddess Juno. So be sure to come back next week, and you can RSVP on the Hammer Museum website. And please stick around at the end of today's presentation, and John will be happy to take audience questions, which you can submit via the chat window on your screen. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Claudia. I'm glad to welcome all of you to this talk and to the series that it's part of, which normally I'd be giving in the Billy Wilder Theater, but here we are in my study at home, not far from the Hammer Museum. Well, why here and now? Because we'll be seeing a good many Rembrandts that are here in museums in Los Angeles, which hold a remarkable number of fine works by him. And the now of my title is the view of Rembrandt we have now, after a half-century of discoveries and changed opinions about the artist and his work. In the first 2 talks in this series, I took Rembrandt as a painter to midlife. Then in the third, we examined his activity as a draftsman and an etcher. My emphasis so far has been on storytelling, on the narrative pictures, which were his most important by the standards of his time. Today, we'll consider his many portraits of himself and start by looking at this one. I'm going to leave it on the screen and show a few details, and in no hurry, without saying anything, just looking at it with you. Rembrandt shows himself close up, seeming larger than life. He looks grand, even majestic, dressed in a sumptuous, old-fashioned outfit. He painted this when he was 52 years old. According to life expectancy in Holland in his time, 52 made him an old man. And by this time, he'd already made about 60 self-portraits, and there were 10 or a dozen still to come. So why did Rembrandt paint self-portraits? And why so many? There've been a lot of reasons offered, some factual, some speculative. Everybody agrees that as his career developed, Rembrandt used self-portraits for various different purposes. As a young, ambitious history painter in Leiden, he appears as an actor in his own painted scenes. He's a student of expression so that he can learn to play from his own face how the actors in his narrative scenes can act their parts more convincingly. He uses himself as a character type in pictures of single figures that the Dutch called tronies. And very quickly, he had pupils of his own, and he was using his self-portraits as teaching material, as works for his pupils to copy and even emulate. He uses his own image for lighting studies too. And as he succeeds as a portrait painter in Amsterdam, and he moves up in society and starts to make some serious money, he paints himself as a Renaissance gentleman and citizen. As a mature, accomplished man, he presents himself as an artist, as an etcher at work, and as a painter. And all along the way, many of his self-portraits are merchandise on view in his studio to protect prospective customers for sale and sought after by collectors. We prefer to see them as intimate and revealing, but that doesn't mean that he kept them for himself. There's no evidence that he did that, or that he meant them as some kind of private autobiography. Rembrandt had many different motives to sit facing the mirror and draw or paint himself. I'm going to return to each of them. First, he started out as an actor in his own pictures. He painted the stoning to death of St. Stephen in 1625 when he was an ambitious 19-year-old. And Rembrandt is there in the background wearing a pained expression. He's not throwing rocks, but he's not intervening either. He's part of a Jewish mob that killed Stephen, the young Christian deacon, while he and the others just let it happen. For the artist to include himself in a historical scene was an ancient idea, literally. Plutarch praised Phidias, the greatest ancient Greek painter, for putting himself into a battle scene he painted on the shield of Athena. And there are a lot of other examples. At a trivial level, it provided a kind of parlor game for the owners of pictures and their guests, find the artist. Here's a scene from a Dutch history painter, Jan Woudanus, a Leiden painter Rembrandt would have known about. If you've got good eyes and a good screen, you can pick out one man who's not in uniform looking at you, the painter in the blue circle. Like Rembrandt, he's there to bear witness to a historical event and bring its moral lesson into the present day. In the Passion series he painted for the Prince of Orange, Rembrandt is there in several of the scenes. He plays the role of the well-dressed man in the beret, who's so prominent in the raising of the cross, wearing a frown as he lends a hand in the execution. His patron, the Prince of Orange, would have recognized Rembrandt here. He's put himself in the picture to acknowledge the Calvinist belief that Christ died for the sins of all humankind, and that he, Rembrandt, is implicated like everyone else in the death of Christ, and that by confessing this in an act of faith, he will be saved. He also gives his feature to the man who receives the broken corpse of Christ and looks up. His pose and his open mouth echo Christ's gruesome face. A Calvinist poet described Christ's tortures and wrote, "It was not the Jews, Lord Jesus, who crucified you. It is I, Lord, who have done all this to thee." Rembrandt saw himself primarily as a history painter, and he made drawings and etchings during those years to practice the actor's skills of facial expression. The purpose was to make the emotions of the characters in his narratives credible. At the beginning, he's showing off what we think of as a bohemian disorder: wiry hair, hunched shoulders, brows contracted a bit, and a sidelong look at the mirror. So is this acting? If you didn't know it was a self-portrait, you'd take the expression perhaps for doubt or suspicion. He's made it seem momentary, partly because of the hasty-looking, impulsive lines. He uses other small etchings to express more states of mind. These have been described as the many moods of Rembrandt that he confided to paper, a sort of post-adolescent mugging in the mirror, trying on various personalities. Well, there may be some truth in that, but the view nowadays is that his main motive was more practical: to build a repertory of facial expressions that he could use in his stock in trade, which was making small narrative paintings with many figures and powerful dramatic action. Rembrandt certainly read the treatise published in 1604 by Karel van Mander and its prescription that a painter should master what was called the affects, that is, joy, grief, rage, regret, anger, sorrow, and so on. He gives instructions for depicting them and also suggests that young artists study expressions from life. The first critical writer about Rembrandt, Constantijn Huygens, described the dramatist as one who gives himself over entirely to dealing with what he wants to express from within himself. These little etchings are the first studies of emotions in the mirror by anybody. And of course, he made drawings of himself. The hair is wild, which we've seen before, and would certainly have looked unconventional in Rembrandt's time. He uses just a few pen strokes for the mouth and the eyes, just enough to capture an expression of kind of weary surprise, slightly oblique. On the right is a painting on copper etching plate. It's just 6 inches high. It's one of the first paintings that show him looking a bit quizzically at himself in the mirror, which he knows will be the equivalent of looking at the spectator. And he wears a beret, one of the first of many berets we'll see on his head, and a white shirt bunched up at the neck. Both of these bits of costumes were anachronisms in 1630, obsolete items that take him out of the present and back a century or so into the past. Rembrandt used his supply of small etching plates to paint 2 other heads. First, he supplied gold leaf. He applied that to reflect light up through the translucent layers of paint above. The fact that all 3 are exactly the same size suggests that he meant them to be seen together and compared. They're each startlingly lifelike, but for different reasons. It's been argued recently that in this trio of pictures, Rembrandt meant to demonstrate 3 different styles of painting. They'd be analogous to the poetical styles that Virgil prescribed for different subjects. On the left, rough for the laughing soldier. On the right, refined and smooth for the pious old woman. And for himself, in the middle, something in between. This seems plausible to me, especially for a literate artist who'd been to Latin school and was already attracting pupils and explaining and demonstrating his methods. The soldier on the left is not Rembrandt himself. He's a cruder type and intended to be the opposite of his own suavely modeled face, not to mention the meticulously detailed old woman on the right. The soldier shows the first stage in a painting to laying in the forms and the lights, using in broad strokes to do that. The refinements of modeling normally come next to soften the light to dark transitions, but here they didn't. You can see the detached strokes and you realize they're getting the job of modeling done by the power of suggestion, with help from you, the spectator. In a life-size painting, this technique would be considered very advanced. But of course, Frans Hals had arrived at it already. This was called the rough style that he used for paintings of young people or of amusing, crazy people, a style that now in the 1630s could be considered suitable for a finished picture, at least by Hals's clientele in Haarlem. Amsterdam and Rembrandt were more conservative. This little painting is only 6 inches high, remember, and it was meant to be held in the hand and inspected up close, where its virtuoso technique of floating highlights has an effect of surprise and delight. It's something like magic. Even now, long lost or entirely unknown Rembrandt self-portraits still turn up. One appeared a dozen years ago. I was overjoyed when it found a home nearby here. It's on copper, 9 inches high, and shows Rembrandt with a surprising pose and expression, leaning back and laughing. Laughing was something that decorum allowed only lower class people, such as drunks and naughty girls and soldiers, to do in pictures, but not better born people. But this isn't a portrait. It's a type of costume piece called a tronie, which we'll return to. Like those little etchings you saw, it was intended as a study of an emotional state, one of the so-called affects. It's also in the rough style. What's on the screen here is an area of the painting 2¼ inches high. Despite the minute size, it has what the Rembrandt scholar Ernst van de Wetering called, and I'm quoting him, a constellation of cursorily and remarkably thickly applied flesh-colored highlights in the face. These touches help to suggest the fleeting nature of the facial expression. When I lived in the Netherlands and I worked a block down the street from the Mauritshuis, I'd go and look at this self-portrait for hours. It was a kind of benchmark for Rembrandt's early style, and it radiated self-assurance, especially for an artist of 23. He dressed up again in a gorget, that piece of military armor, which seemed to reinforce the confidence that he projected. And the way he painted it was amazing to me. It was subtle in the light and shade and finely finished in all of its surfaces. In 1990 came a surprise. Another version came to light in a German museum, the one on the left. It had been dismissed as a copy, but it was clearly better. Better because it is even livelier and more delicate than the one in the Mauritshuis. So much that the version I loved had to be by somebody else, somebody close to Rembrandt during his Leiden years. And there were really only 2 artists who could function at this high level, Jan Lievens and Gerard Douw. Lievens on the left worked alongside Rembrandt as a kind of rival and probably studio mate. This is a portrait of Rembrandt by Lievens, which is relatively dry in the solid parts and extra fluffy in the hair. Comparing the 2 pictures lets us excuse Lievens from contention as the painter of the Mauritshuis picture on the right, leaving Rembrandt's most successful pupil, Gerard Douw. Like Rembrandt, Douw made self-portraits from the beginning of his career to the end, although many fewer. Douw is easily confused with Rembrandt in these early years. That's proof of how well he succeeded at what you were supposed to strive for as a pupil, to paint like your master. You might ask, though, why would he copy his master's self-portrait anyway? Well, for practice and for profit. Profit for the master. This is the first of many self-portraits by Rembrandt that were copied by pupils, or were the basis of variant versions by pupils, which Rembrandt could sell legitimately under the rules of the Painters Guild as his own work. Rembrandt hadn't yet achieved anything like the fame that he was going to have in 4 or 5 years' time, when owning one of his self-portraits evidently began to appeal to collectors. And of course, that appeal has been permanent. I want to return to that bit of military equipment that both artists are wearing, the metal throat protector called a gorget. Rembrandt was not a militiaman. He's wearing fancy dress, maybe not simply to look eccentric or picturesque, though. Perry Chapman has connected these assumed military identities to Dutch pride in the independence they had achieved from Spain by courage and by military prowess. For Rembrandt, the armor was what she calls the ideal guise, embodying a patriotic ideal, in other words, without his actually having to act on it. We're going to see this patriotic theme again when we come to the Amsterdam militia and the night watch. Rembrandt appears in other guises and pushes his techniques further. In this etching, he did something quite startling, not even using an etching needle, but instead a quill pen to scratch through the coating on the plate. It made thinner or thicker lines, even a double line, depending on how much pressure he applied. This was an experiment he didn't repeat, but you can feel the force and the speed and the vitality of the hatched lines for the dark areas and the scribbled lines that make his face lifelike. He looks right at the mirror. His hair is unruly as usual, but he has a love lock, which is a fashionable kind of loose fall of hair that men wore on one side. He wears everyday clothes, nothing fancy. This painting is astonishing in a different way. The light comes in from an oblique angle so that his hair and cheek throw his eyes into shadow. This is something entirely new in portraits. Where the etching shows his eyes open and candid, the painting veils them. The eyes are the windows of the soul, as the ancient cliche went. So why are they shaded, we want to know. A good case has been made that a deeper kind of personal statement is here, that Rembrandt identified himself with one of the 4 temperaments. We would call them personality types, specifically melancholy. Melancholics were believed to suffer from an imbalance of humors in the body. They were Saturnine, born under Saturn, which inclines them to be solitary, self-absorbed, discontented, and self-doubting. The good news was that these were the traits of artists and other creative people. Dürer had given melancholics a pose and a lighting scheme in a print that all artists knew. In the center, hand upholding his head, his face in shadow, attributes that had become those of intellectuals and even students, like the one in the picture at the right. In 1621, Robert Burton published the best-selling treatise, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Melancholia has been called the ailment of the age. And in Rembrandt's case, it's paired with impatience, expressed in the energetic curly hairs that he doesn't paint, but instead scratches in with the butt end of the brush. This was a radical self-image for an artist compared to the many other contemporary self-portraits that we have. For example, Adrian de Vries in the middle barely looks a generation older, wants to show you not only what he looks like, but also to give you the essential social facts about him, that he's a painter from the palette and the brush he's holding, and that he's a gentleman from what he's wearing, and that he's educated from what he's been reading, a treatise by Dürer, displayed where you can't miss it. Another Amsterdam painter, successful, Nicolaas Elias on the right, dispenses with the tools completely, but it demonstrates all of his refinement of lighting and pose and brushwork on himself. Rembrandt, in contrast, makes a mystery of himself, which is, while at the same time showing off what he can do. To cast a side light on Rembrandt, here are two more brilliant young contemporaries of his, Anthony van Dyck in the middle and Gian Lorenzo Bernini on the right. Van Dyck looks tousle and winsome, but hardly mysterious, in fact, kind of available. Bernini shows himself in a more complex state of mind, alert, perhaps wary, but he does it straightforwardly with no tricks of light or pose. In these early years, Rembrandt assumed identities that were patriotic, melancholic, and in these cases, exotic. The Italian writer Baldinucci wrote that Rembrandt went to the markets and bought old-fashioned and bizarre and picturesque costumes and hung them on his walls. Like the self-portraits in military clothes, these pictures weren't intended as portraits in any conventional sense, but as tronies, a particular kind of vivid character and costume study, usually just half-length or bust-length, that was popular among collectors at the time. You saw some of those in the first two talks in this series. In the etching in the middle, he imagines that he's a fierce-looking Eastern warrior, a Tamerlane. And in the painting on the left, a 16th century courtier who's been rewarded by a prince with a gold chain. And in the full-length picture at the right, which is only 2.5 feet high, he's gone to the trunk and hauled out quite a lot, including a silk robe and a turban. And after the picture was finished, added a dog to it. Anyway, if you take that standing man on the right and enlarge it to life size and substitute an older man's face, and you have the ultimate tronie, the so-called noble Slav at the Met, Rembrandt's early masterpiece of the exotic, who wears Rembrandt's best, a fantastic gold robe, Indian scarf, a glistening turban, who stares you down. Rembrandt began to picture himself as a member of the social class that he'd joined or drew close to after his move to Amsterdam. There was surely some wish fulfillment here, a wish to be admitted to the well-to-do upper class and upper middle class that his portrait sitters belonged to. In the painting on the left, he doesn't hold back. He wears an embroidered cloak with velvet facing, an up-to-date hat with a brim, a so-called falling ruff, and gold buttons on his doublet. We know a lot more today than we used to about what people wore in Rembrandt's time, not just the details and the chronology of the costumes, but also what they must have said to observant members of the upper class and to arrivistes as well. Rembrandt's costume says, "I'm one of you." And his expression says, "You can believe that." Rembrandt worked hard on the etching on the right. It must have been important to him because it went through 11 states with constant refinements. This wasn't just perfectionism, it was rivalry. And it's obvious which famous upper-class Netherlandish painter Rembrandt wanted to rival, Peter Paul Rubens in Antwerp was hugely prolific, wealthy, a collector himself, ennobled by the King of Spain. Charles I of England had just knighted Rubens and given him the gold chain that barely peeps out from his cloak, pseudo-modestly. Rubens first painted himself, then he had this excellent engraved copy made to be sure that the image circulated widely among art collectors, and this is important, among people who collected pictures of great men, whatever their profession. Rubens projected the easy confidence that Italians called sprezzatura, which Rembrandt must have admired but was still working on. Well, during Rembrandt's career, the dress-up doesn't stop. At the left, he gives himself a beard and an outfit that turns back the clock a century or so. He has a huge velvet beret with a feather, a gorgeous cloak with an elaborate frogging down, and a fancy epaulette, and under that, a jerkin over a shirt. We don't know quite what to make of this. Would his contemporaries have seen it as Rembrandt masquerading as a figure of past time, or seen it as a tronie, a fanciful male figure in a stagey pose, dressed like somebody's great-grandfather? We're in border territory here, and between self-portrait of Rembrandt and Rembrandt as model. A few of his experiments are so strange and unsympathetic that their attributions were downgraded to pupils in the studio. This one was restored to Rembrandt fairly recently, and I think correctly, but there's no denying how bizarre the outfit is or how ambiguous the almost timid expression is that he wears underneath the weight of this enormous headgear. This is a much more famous picture in the gallery in Dresden, where most paintings have yellowed varnish like this, I'm afraid. For centuries, it was thought to be a double portrait of Rembrandt and Saskia, his wife. They wear old-fashioned costumes. He looks back cheerfully, drink in one hand and the young woman's waist in the other. She sits on his lap and looks at us with a faint, knowing smile. There's a peacock on the table. They've got it all. For a long time, this was seen as an autobiography by Rembrandt. Here we are on top of the world. Today, a lot more has been learned about this picture. Rembrandt, or somebody close to him, made a drawing of a similar couple whose relationship has advanced a step or two. Behind them is a bare-chested girl with a lute, and there's a bed at the right. The place is a bordello, and the subject is the prodigal son, from the parable in the Gospel of St. Luke, which says that the son took his inheritance and wasted his substance with riotous living. Artists in the previous century often set that scene in an inn or a brothel, just as the drawing does. And sure enough, an X-ray of the painting shows the figure of a girl just where she is in the drawing, where the blue arrow is, but now she's painted out. What's more, the X-ray reveals the outlines of stretcher bars where the red arrow points that once supported the canvas from the back, and they are not in the position they should have for a canvas of this shape. The explanation has come as a surprise. This famous picture was originally more than twice as big, with proportions like the drawing. This is the recent reconstruction by Ernst van de Wetering, demonstrating that the painting was cropped down at some point to less than half its original size, maybe because it was damaged, or more probably because an owner or a dealer wanted the bordello edited out and the topless girl to disappear for reasons of taste or prudery. The painting that's left was conveniently seen as a rollicking double portrait rather than a biblical parable with the painter and his wife serving as models. Did Rembrandt intend the picture as an acknowledgement or even a confession of his own indulgent life? That's been argued, but I think it's a stretch. Here's a subject we haven't yet seen. Rembrandt at work, drawing. That's a chalk holder in his hand. Saskia is shown looking on. This is no slice of daily life, though. He's wearing a feathered beret and a cloak again. This is Renaissance costume, not work clothes. And she's got a distinctly old-fashioned cap and dress. He's presenting himself and his wife in allegorical guise. The proverb goes, love gives birth to art. You see it inscribed on Dutch family portraits, Liefde baart kunst. Why is he drawing rather than painting or etching? It's an ancient truism that drawing is fundamental to art. And you might say, drawing gives birth to art, which is, I imagine, why he presents himself this way. His shaded eyes tell us he hasn't lost that quality of inwardness, of melancholia, even as he looks out at us. Rembrandt had been picturing himself in old-fashioned costumes more often than not, starting with the two at the right, both in the Louvre, both dated 1633. You see him in combinations of more or less Renaissance velvet robes, silk facings, linen neckcloths, and soft berets. You wouldn't know he was a painter at all. But from the gold chain, you'd assume he must be eminent at something worthy of princely reward, even if he never did receive it from the Prince of Orange, his client during those years. The stagey expressions on the right give way to the calm that you see him projecting on the left in the Norton Simon portrait of a few years later. His forehead and the slight contraction of his eyebrows suggest the passage of thought through the artist's mind. This beautiful picture has had a hard life. It was painted on a wood panel, and it's been worn down over the centuries by severe cleanings. When the Rembrandt Research Committee studied it in the 1980s, it became a victim to the arbitrary standards that the members sometimes applied, and it was reattributed to Rembrandt's best pupil, Karel Fabritius. 30 years later, a dissenting member of the committee has restudied the picture in its clean state. He's seen the subtleties of its brushwork. He's taken into account both its damaged condition and its great strengths, and he's concluded that Rembrandt himself must have painted it. And I think he's right. Nearing the height of the success he had in the later 1630s, Rembrandt imagines himself as a Renaissance courtier. He's seen a portrait of a real one, that is Baldassare Castiglione, the man who wrote the book on the subject, Il Cortegiano, which is a guide on how a gentleman can succeed at court, painted by none other than Raphael. Rembrandt never traveled to Italy, but he learned a lot about Italian painting from reproductive prints, which he collected in great numbers, and by seeing them in the original for sale, because Amsterdam was a major art market for old masters as well as contemporary art. Rembrandt was an art dealer on the side, so it's no surprise that he cultivated Alfonso Lopez, the diplomat and art collector who owned this picture. Lopez had bought it at auction, where Rembrandt made a little drawing of it with some field notes about the prices. You may see that the picture made 3,500 guilders, a huge price, more than double what Rembrandt was going to get paid later on for the night watch. You've already seen what Rembrandt took from Raphael for his self-portrait, the pose in general and the clasped hands, but he gave himself a more direct gaze towards the viewer. Lopez owned another Renaissance portrait that Rembrandt must have studied by the young Titian, that at the time was believed to represent the poet Ludovico Ariosto. That picture inspired another self-portrait by Rembrandt, a painting where he rests his arm on the sill. He gives himself a different costume, but every part of it belongs to the previous century, to the time of the great men he must have considered his ancestors, Raphael and Titian, and we should add, Dürer. Dürer painted himself in a similar pose. Rembrandt was probably also looking at images of other important painters who preceded him in the Netherlands, such as Bernard van Orley at the top center, and below him, Rembrandt's townsman, Lucas van Leyden. We've been learning from costume historians that Rembrandt's trademark berets, at the time called bonnets, came from these images and others like it. Rembrandt evidently studied their dignified attitudes and their clothing. He'd also have known another book of a few years earlier, Vasari's Lives of the Artists, with woodcuts of famous Italian artists, including Michelangelo at the top. These were Rembrandt's Italian ancestors, you could say. So why would you portray yourself dressed as a Netherlandish artist of a century earlier? Well, it was to emphasize your nationality and to make your lineage clear. And as for the beret, Rembrandt's ambitious pupils, Ferdinand Bol and Gerard Godard Flink, were quick to pick it up. On the subject of self-portraits by the pupils, the best was by Rembrandt's most talented and original pupil, Karel Fabritius, who died young. He had a distinct artistic personality and evidently no interest in following fashion. His moody self-portraits have a rich, rough technique derived from Rembrandt's and a particular color sense, all his own. During much of the 18th and 19th century, this self-conscious and self-confident image was tinged with irony because it was seen as a Rembrandt riding high before the fall of a few years later, when, as legend had it, his ambitious militia portrait failed and caused him to fall from public esteem. Well, although by all measures the Night Watch was actually a success, the myth of a spectacular failure still colored the popular view of Rembrandt until the 1960s, which was that he overreached, his career peaked, and then was rejected, wounded, overlooked, and eventually forgotten, and in the process became wiser and purer. This romantic view was partly fueled by a heavily novelized biography by Hendrik Willem van Loon of 1930, and the biopic by Alexander Korda, starring Charles Laughton in the greatest role of his career, which my parents loved to tell me about. You're seeing the scene of the imaginary unveiling in front of a crowd, which is met by a long, uncomfortable silence that's finally broken by a single giggle and then a roar of mocking laughter. Now, all of that was fictitious, but it made for a better movie. Now, this isn't to say that Rembrandt's life was untroubled. The number of self-portraits did fall off in the 1640s and stayed sporadic until the early 50s for reasons we don't really know, but may be connected with Saskia's death in 1642 and his 6-year affair with a nursemaid that ended bitterly. In the meantime, Rembrandt acquired a new mistress, Hendrikje Stoffels, and a happy relationship for a dozen years. During that time, the self-portraits are more frequent. Here in 1848, there's no more playing an Italian courtier or Netherlandish old master. There's just the artist at work in an ordinary coat and shirt and hat with a narrow brim. He pictures himself looking intently at the mirror and working on an etching plate, probably the same one that printed the paper that we're looking at. At this point, he's been putting a lot of labor into his masterpiece of etching, the so-called 100 Guilder print. which got a lot of our attention in the previous talk. It has a phenomenal number of lines and small touches, plus a good deal of dry point to deepen the shadowed areas. That's the technique here, too, which gives clarity to the first impressions that he took from the plate, which were minus the landscape and had an unfinished look to the table and his shirt. In this drawing 4 years later, he has the same clothes and hat. The inscription in French says, Rembrandt dressed in the way he was accustomed to dress in the studio. In the painting of just about the same time, there's no easel or palette or brushes, just the man in a sturdy stance, fully frontal, hands on his hips, brow contracted. It's a pose we're apt to read as defiant, knowing what we do about his temperament. We may see pride, even imagine ourselves as visitors to the studio being confronted by him. I should say that the painting has a heavy yellow varnish that obscures whatever subtle tints Rembrandt put in the face. What may have seemed truculent in the Vienna painting is gone in the Frick picture. He sits in a chair that's a little elevated so that he seems to look down at us. And he fills the frame so that he seems closer to us than usual. He's splendidly dressed. Only recently did we learn what his costume is and what associations were for Rembrandt and his audience, thanks to the costume specialist, Marijke de Winkel. It's not work clothes. Again, it's fancy dress, what she calls an amalgam of 16th century historical dress and Oriental elements. He has the beret or the bonnet that we've seen before and the fur-lined tabard. The big pleated yellow garment that's so striking resembles a jerkin, but the diagonally crossed neckcloth underneath it was normally found only in Asian costume, like the red sash and the rattan cane with a silver knob here. As for all that wonderful yellow, a color that's rare in clothing at this time, de Winkel makes a clever suggestion that Rembrandt not only looked at engraved portraits of 16th century artists, but he also read about them. She quotes Van Mander in 1604, describing two great masters, Jan Gossart, called Mabuse, and Lucas van Leyden. And he says, Mabuse acted in a very stately manner, resplendent in a garment of cloth, gold. And Lucas wore a jerkin of yellow silk camlet in which the sunshine had the luster of gold. So Rembrandt dressed himself as an eminent old master, it seems, with some Asian touches. To find another artist portrayed with anything like this costume and pose, you have to look to Anthony van Dyck. This is his great portrait of the one-armed painter, Martin Reichert, wearing a cardinal red Polish kaftan. Rembrandt may not have seen the painting, but he surely knew this engraved reproduction of it. The commanding pose that Rembrandt strikes had been unknown for ordinary citizens. Previously, you had to be a procurator of St. Mark's in Venice and have Tintoretto to paint your portrait to get a treatment like this. I think Rembrandt also had Titian in mind. Titian, painter to kings and to the Holy Roman Emperor, here painting himself in old age, powerful, alert, maybe a touch irascible. Van Mander and other writers of Rembrandt's time held out Titian as the model for painters of rich color and the so-called rough style. Here he uses broad strokes for his costume and hands, but not for the face, which he finished more carefully. Rembrandt did something similar. You can see how this works with the sleeve, which he models with an underlayer and then drags a series of layers of white paint over it. The difference of technique in the face is obvious. You see the eyes and mouth and the nostrils quite carefully painted. but the rich brocade neckcloth is suggested by a welter of broken strokes. This is the image of a man steadfast in adversity, dressed not like his contemporaries, but like his artist ancestors. He's a man outside time. He shows he's capable of the heights of virtuosity in the way he conceives and paints his own picture. It's actually been suggested that in posing enthroned and holding a scepter and dressing himself like royalty, Rembrandt was claiming a title given traditionally to Apelles, the greatest Greek painter, Prince of Painters. In the following year, he paints himself quite differently, without the regal self-assurance, vulnerable, if anything. He paints his face with much more impasto, that three-dimensional buildup of paint in relief, so that the ridges and furrows of his eyes and forehead cast actual shadows, not just fictive ones. The paint is translucent in places, so you can actually see the brush drawing underneath. Here he realized the potential he demonstrated in the face of that soldier 30 years earlier. He built that one up with opaque patches. In his own face later on, the same kind of lay-in with broad brushes there, but on top of it, there's a mesh of smaller detached strokes that give the surface a subtler texture without ever seeming smooth. His pose almost repeats one of 20 years earlier. But what a history lies between them. What experience, what ups and downs of fortune. A year later, he shows himself at the easel, painting. This was an old-fashioned setup for a self-portrait. He originally wore a big beret, as you might be able to make out from the outline, but he changed his mind and he substituted a simple white linen cap of a kind we have seen before that men often wore indoors. Here he seems neither grand nor vulnerable, but looks at us candidly. Simply a man doing his work. When you're in the Louvre, you can leave this picture and walk for a few minutes through the galleries and arrive at his only competitor as the greatest history painter of his age, Nicolas Poussin. Poussin painted only 2 self-portraits, this one reluctantly at the request of his patron Paul Freyard de Chanteloup, but telling him that he wasn't a portrait painter. He was first painter to the king, but he'd removed himself from the intrigues at Versailles and was working in Rome when he painted this. He's dressed for the occasion and he shows himself with big paintings behind him, framing him, you could say, confining him, determining his identity. He wants to be seen as every inch the official personage. His mouth and his brow contracted signal his seriousness, his powers of concentration too. The composition is all disciplined geometry, and the painting style is exact, even severe. No rough style or mysterious light for him. His image expresses his self-control and portrays and proclaims his position in the world. Rembrandt again imagines himself in historical guise, this time a specific biblical one, St. Paul, complete with Paul's customary attributes, the book of scripture he's holding, and a sword protruding from his cloak, a reminder of what Paul himself called the sword of the Spirit. Why St. Paul? Well, in Calvinist thinking, Paul was known as the pen of God, the former persecutor who converted to Christianity and became its greatest missionary. He must have been a kind of patron saint for Rembrandt, who painted him often. Paul was the foremost interpreter of scripture, and he defined the central tenet of Calvinist belief, the doctrine of grace. If you have faith, you have forgiveness. God confers grace on you whether you deserve it or not. Perry Chapman has written that Paul part of Paul's appeal for Rembrandt was this constant self-examination, which suited Rembrandt's melancholy temperament very well. I think that's evident from the way Rembrandt's pictures Paul for 30 years, sunk in the task of shedding light on great truths. That's a task we can imagine Rembrandt saw as his task too. Rembrandt gave Paul one of the most vivid heads in all of art. It has rough surfaces everywhere, a thick buildup of paint in the forehead and nose, and flickering white scumbles for the hair. And the expression makes it unforgettable. There's no authority in it, but is it uncertainty, questioning, self-examining? Could it be struggling to understand? Now we come to the strangest thing Rembrandt ever painted. A self-portrait that, despite being cut down, damaged, and obscured by dirty varnish, has a weird kind of power. For a long time, we had only weak hypotheses to explain the silver of a portrait on the easel, the sliver of a portrait that's he's painting, and why he's grinning at us. Until Albert Blankert proposed that this picture by Art de Gelder is the key. De Gelder was Rembrandt's last pupil. He must have known Rembrandt's self-portrait in its original condition, because he made this version of it 20 years later. It was much bigger than the fragment that survives. In other words, it's a case like the cut-down prodigal son we saw earlier. De Gelder's picture, reflecting Rembrandt's, illustrates an anecdote about Zeuxis, the virtuoso painter in ancient Greece, who died an improbable death. Van Mander retold it in 1604. Zeuxis, he wrote, is said to have departed this life while laughing immoderately, choking, while painting a wrinkled, funny old woman. By this time, Rembrandt's painting style looked old-fashioned to some people, crude, dark, even ugly. There may be a parable here, Rembrandt reenacting the role of the great and famous Greek painter, but perhaps having the last laugh. So far, nobody has explained Rembrandt's intentions convincingly. The most imposing and original self-portrait by Rembrandt after the Frick painting is this one. He faces us head on, having been at work on the picture whose edges we can just see at the very right edge. Now he's back in historical costume, in a combination of jerkin and shirt and tabard that identifies him again with old masters of the 16th century. But the cap is contemporary menswear. The big circles on the wall have been and still are a puzzle. There have been many ingenious explanations, but the most likely is that they are the edges of wall maps of the world, the kinds that you see hanging on the walls of Dutch rooms and paintings, suggested rather than detailed. And it's been proposed that they might refer to the visible world that Rembrandt masters through his art. Well, this is not only the most imposing of the last self-portraits, it's also the least finished. Again, he paints his face loosely, impulsively, and the costume and the palettes and the brushes are just sketched in with a few strokes. So should we consider it unfinished? According to the biographer Arnold Houbraken, a generation later, Rembrandt's motto was, "A work is finished when the master has achieved his intention with it." With no client to please with the portrait, the answer to whether it's finished may not matter. In any case, it advertises his virtuosity once again, and it suggests another parallel outside Holland. About 10 years earlier, the Spanish court painter Diego Velázquez finished this picture of a princess and her attendants visiting the painter's own studio. He's busy painting her parents, the king and the queen. We see them reflected in the mirror. The scene is painted from the king's vantage point, which includes the painter at work. Painting a commissioned royal portrait, Velázquez wasn't as free as Rembrandt to show off his virtuosity with the brush, but he slips some in anyway. His fingers converge on the brush. In the same way the brush hairs converge, those fingers are kind of extension of the painter's whole being. The palette and the rippling white linen of his sleeve are little showcases for what he could do. Just as Rembrandt's sketchy palette and brushes flaunt his bravura, the dashing art of abbreviation with the brush that he inherited from Titian. This portrait is dated 1669, the year that Rembrandt died at the age of 63. His face is puffier. His head weighs down on his shoulders as though he were burdened. After the resolute images of himself he'd been painting just a few years earlier, this one has struck many writers as the sad farewell of a lonely man who's aware of his own diminished powers. One prominent art historian wrote in 1940 that the face has a pensive gaze, silent and alone. The end was not far away. This was thought to be the only self-portrait of the last years of Rembrandt's life. Now, we're all apt to project onto the faces of people what we expect or what we want to see. In any event, he paints his face with no diminished powers. He gives it all the richness of surface that we have been seeing, and he brushes in his beret with long, absolutely confident strokes. And it's turned out not to be the only self-portrait of that year, after all. This one was thought to date to the early 60s, but some time ago the date 1669 was found on it. And nobody's detected a decline here. He still paints himself in historical clothing, this time in late medieval doublet with a fur collar modeled on what Flemish painters of the 15th century wore. The X-ray reveals that he first held a brush in his hand, but then changed his mind and instead shows himself with folded hands. He wears a white cap in the X-ray of the kind we've seen when he was at work. He painted over it and gave himself the old-fashioned beret that we see. In the course of his work on this painting, Rembrandt's image of himself went from artist at work to old master. Do you see sadness in it? I don't. I see pride. I see resolute dignity. And I see him reasserting his strength. In the next talk in the series, there will be more evidence that Rembrandt was not forgotten in the 1650s and 60s, beginning with the greatest commissioned work of his late years, this portrait of a committee of Amsterdam cloth merchants. I hope you'll come back if you can and join me here. And please stay healthy till then.
Oh, thank you so much, John. That was so fascinating. Now, you said that Rembrandt painted, what, 70 self-portrait paintings? And how many of those etchings and drawings do you think?
A lot more. I don't have the number, but a lot more. Yeah, at least another, maybe 30 more.
And if they were used as sort of teaching tools or as preparation for paintings, were they also for sale? And who would purchase them? What was the market for that?
Yeah, we don't know much about that, but the big fact is that he didn't have any in his inventory in 1656. If self-portraiture had been some kind of inner quest, some private autobiographical enterprise, something like that, he'd have kept some, you'd think. No, I think they were for sure for sale, which is a very interesting question. Who bought them? Should I answer my own question?
Yeah, I mean, do you know?
Yeah, there's a whole class of people who were buying Rembrandt pictures generally. And this maybe in particular, the so-called Liefhebber, the amateur, who was a sort of all-rounder, typically had an education, someone like Rembrandt's, who went to Latin school, who read a lot, who read even the lives of the artists by Karel van Mander a little earlier, and who bought not just works of art, but took an active interest in how they were made and the relative merits of the artists. They bought pictures, including self-portraits, because they could be hung in their houses and they could be used by the successful Liefhebber, the really good collector, to instruct and perhaps shame the competition to go one better than one's competitors. They knew what was what in the art world. They went to auction sales. They made the rounds of the dealers, such as they were, and artist studios, and they talked. And the more Rembrandt put out there into the market, the more familiar he became, and the more he got talked about. And buying these things is all part of a kind of cultivation, meaning that these are people who were brought up on a kind of Italian tradition of knowledge and good manners and good behavior. And some of them might actually have been collectors of another slightly different kind, which is a collector of pictures of great people, famous people. That was a whole category of collecting. And it had been, bring on number 70, could you? I showed some of these collectors who would buy prints and sometimes paintings too, of artist portraits and other great men's portraits in the tradition of Roman collectors and people of wealth and emperors and the like who collected portrait busts. So you were keeping good company, in other words, in your house, if you had portraits of famous people. And if you had a portrait of Rembrandt like the one on the screen, well, you were leading the pack.
Interesting. I hate to be cheesy and make this parallel, but in today's influencer culture, people who take selfies are branding themselves. And I know it's a completely different story, but I can't imagine purchasing one of those selfie portraits. But there is a parallel. I mean, he may have originated the selfie.
I think so. Yeah, he may have. Well, in any case, he played on a tradition of celebrity, and just in the way he's posed in this picture, he's just advertising a certain combination of what the Italians would have called grandezza and sprezzatura, easy, confident superiority. And next to him are pictures of famous artists of the past. So this is the kind of stuff that collectors bought, not just these, of course, but they bought landscapes and still lifes and all kinds of other pictures too. And Rembrandt also hoped to sell them history paintings, much more expensive items, sometimes bigger.
I should mention to the audience out there that you are very welcome to ask your questions of John Walsh. And if it's not obvious to you where you can type your question into the chat, you may be in full screen mode, so you'll need to exit full screen mode, and then in the upper right corner, you should see a speech bubble icon, and you click on that, and that's where the chat is going on, and you can put your questions in there. I'm gonna ask a question coming in from Jenny Subramanian. She said, did Rembrandt's tradition of self-portraiture inspire other artists to do the same? Did he influence the practice of self-portraiture within painting more broadly?
Yes, he did. These portraits were well known. If you couldn't see a painting, you could certainly see an etching somewhere. And artists all over Europe, I think, were emboldened to make self-portraits. Nobody made as many as Rembrandt, but they certainly took this as, I think, both a license and a kind of encouragement to portray themselves. Later in the 17th and early 18th century, during the Romantic period, it was common to do this as a kind of autobiographical statement. And after the Romantic period, Rembrandt was seen as a kind of inspiration for the kind of deep-going personal self-exploration that Romantic writers had made the common property of literature. And what I'm saying is that self-portraits by Rembrandt are not intended primarily as some kind of self-probing. The notion of self actually is a kind of later idea. But subsequent artists, seeing how dramatic and complex Rembrandt's self-image was, used that as a way to go deeper for themselves. And so right up until the present time, right up until Lucian Freud, we've got artists posing themselves in ways that are formed in good part by the way Rembrandt saw himself in the mirror. And that includes a great long 19th century of self-portraiture.
My own follow-up to that is that Rembrandt, in a lot of his portraits, he seems kind of jolly. Did he also suffer from depression? Because you talk a lot today about melancholia, and was that prominent?
Yeah, no, melancholia didn't mean depression necessarily. In fact, it just meant a particular kind of turn of mind or temperament. It might bring on depression, but we've no reason to think that Rembrandt was depressive. Unfortunately, we have no reason to think much of anything about his biography except for some things that he did. He was what we know of him is a sort of glancing references to him as a kind of contentious sort, and we know he was in quite a lot of legal cases involving money and the like. And we know that he had marital difficulties, particularly a big time difficulty with a maid servant whom he sent out of the house. In any case, the biographies, as we would mean them, biography in that sense of being intimate descriptions of the person's mentality and mental and intellectual struggles, we have no evidence for that. And we project an awful lot of our own 20th century or 19th century sensibility onto Rembrandt's face. More often than not, he was painting it to be painting it as a demonstration of how he could paint, as well as an image of his own face as it changed over the years, but not necessarily his state of mind from time to time.
Okay, we have a question from A, only identified as A. It says, John, you mentioned that you have not been convinced by the explanations offered by the strange and striking Zeuxis self-portrait. Do you have your own theory?
I missed that key word, the which self-portrait?
The strange and striking Zeuxis self-portrait.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I think I believe this Zeuxis idea. It's the only thing that could explain the laughing or the woman on the easel, the old woman on the easel, which was supposed to have set off Zeuxis into such a fit of laughter that he died of whatever, a heart attack or something. That was the story about Zeuxis. It's the only story that fits, and the only reason why the elderly Rembrandt would smile at himself in the mirror as he painted it. It seems a stretch, but nobody's got a better explanation than that I can think of. If A has one to suggest, use the chat, please.
Yeah, let us know.
Yeah.
MM asks, the etchings look so similar to pen and ink. What dictated why he would pick one medium over the other?
I think it's a question of multiples, isn't it? I mean, an etching, you make a line that's an awful lot like an ink line onto the plate, or rather onto the ground on the plate. And you can see it, it registers, if you're using a light ground or a white ground, it registers like a black line made by a pen. It can't swell or get thinner again. The etching needle is uniform. So in that sense, it can't look like a pen drawing, like some of Rembrandt's pen drawings. I think when I said, my first word was, it's a multiple. It's a way to take what looks like a drawing and make many of them, make 10, 15, 20, 50. The only limitation for Rembrandt was this matter of dry point. Well, first of all, the etching plate will wear and get a little duller and the lines get less crisp. When he uses dry point, which is that technique of gouging, that dry point, which makes such a beautiful black burry darks, that tends to wear off too. So multiples have their limit, but in any case, you can only sell one drawing, but you can sell 25 etchings with great ease.
That actually reminds me of a question I had. I was wondering, you showed some of the pictures that were painted on copper.
Yeah.
Why was he painting on copper, and how did that work?
Why would you do that? Well, it was a tradition that Rembrandt inherited. It was an Italian technique, actually, and it was used in Rome and elsewhere in Italy by major artists to make small pictures. You might think, why would you do that? Well, it gives you a beautiful, perfectly smooth surface, like the best wood panel, and it doesn't warp. And if you care for it, it doesn't change at all. It's got it gives a tint to the paint on top, reddish, like the way canvas and panels are grounded in a reddish brown ground. And you can, if you don't like the red, you can gild it, which Rembrandt actually did in the case of the three little pictures. Oh, I know. I think I wrote down their numbers. Yes. Please bring up bring up slide number 30. Rembrandt actually used a gold ground, meaning he gilded the copper plate to get this. You see it best in the middle picture in the portrait, this wonderful aura around his head. So I think the other big thing is that a painting on copper, these are only 6 or 9 inches tall. The wonderful thing about copper is you can hold it in your hand. I mean, of course you frame it, but you don't have to frame it. You can actually hold that thing, and it feels like a real thing, unlike other media. It has a sort of precious quality. And that was part of the original use, I think, of copper for as a painting ground, rather a painting support. The Italians actually used stone too, semi-precious stone, agate, for example, and also slate, which were absolutely impervious, it seemed anyway, to change, and also gave the owner, a hands-on experience.
Wasn't the agate fragile? It seems like they would break.
If you dropped it, yeah. But the surface is smooth, and the paint stays on it. It doesn't flake off, in other words, if you treat it right.
When they display those now in museums, do you see both sides? That would be fascinating.
Rarely. You wish they did, huh?
That would be very cool. Beth asks about at the MFA Boston, where you were a curator. She says they have a painting described as the artist in his studio. Do you feel that's a self-portrait as well?
Good question. Right. We don't have that, I think, in this particular bunch of images, so I can't show it. But anybody who, when we get off here, if you Google Rembrandt Boston artist in studio, it'll come right up. It is a marvelous little panel about 12 inches high or so of an artist facing a huge painting on an easel. He's looking at the back, we're looking at the back. The artist is looking at the front, and it's staged like a kind of David and Goliath. Is it Rembrandt? features do resemble his, but not so much that everybody's convinced that it's by Rembrandt. It is Rembrandt himself. It may be an artist with Rembrandtish features. In another case, there's a drawing that actually is a drawing in the Getty Museum of an artist, very similar composition, which shows an artist who looks a lot like Jan Lievens, that is Rembrandt's possibly studio mate in Leiden. And he's probably working on a commission that they had, at least not quite jointly, but they were working for the stadtholder, the most important person in the Netherlands, the Prince of Orange, to paint a group of round top paintings of the Passion, including several crucifixion scenes. So anyhow, so the Boston painting is linked up, I think, and must be from the same time as the other drawing by Lievens, but you can look at that too. You can find that image on the Getty website. Just put in Getty Rembrandt drawing artist studio and it'll pop right up.
That's a good opportunity to plug the Getty website called Rembrandt in Southern California, which explores all of the works of Rembrandt that are contained in Southern California museums. And the website itself is almost a work of art. It's really quite brilliant. I
wish we could claim credit, but the person who can claim credit is Cindy Burlingham, the chief curator, deputy director of the Hammer Museum. She thought of this. It was before my time.
Well, host it on the Getty website.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can Google it very quickly.
I think it's rembrandtinsocal.org, but
rembrandtinsocal.org, exactly.
Well, here's a perfectly tailored question from you coming from another John. He asks, what characteristics did Rembrandt and Van Gogh, two Dutch artists centuries apart, share to create probably more standalone self-portraits than any other famous artists in history? And I have to say that might be not current, taking contemporary art into account. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Van Gogh had Rembrandt as a model, and he saw lots and lots of Rembrandt self-portraits. And in several instances, you can see that Van Gogh's image of himself is derived from Rembrandt's model, particularly the one where he's standing at his easel. I think Rembrandt, so there's a link in form and in, you could say, I'm tempted to say self-absorption. These are kind of romantic and modern terms. Rembrandt, I think, wanted above all to make himself known to the world, not just as an artist, but as a man of standing in the world, a man with a profound historical consciousness, and a man of fabulous technique, so that he could put across subtleties in the modeling of the face and in the structure of the head that had seldom been put on in paint before, except by his great Italian Renaissance predecessors. Van Gogh coming along, 2 centuries later, had a lot to choose from, and he didn't just take Rembrandt as his model, but Rembrandt was clearly the one most available and certainly the one who took self-portraiture most seriously.
Amelia asks how a potential client might have been swayed by the pose, glorious clothing, etc., and was that an element of advertising to potential commissions?
That's a good question. I think that, while he was in the studio that he maintained in the house of Arlenburg, when he came from Leiden to Amsterdam and married into the Arlenburg family, for a time he had a studio and did his teaching there, and I am sure showed works of art to anybody who came to Arlenburg studio, and I would bet there'd be a fair number of them. He was already at that point affecting a kind of Renaissance costume, not as grand as you see in the Frick collection, not as expensive either. But all during the 30s, when he then moved to his own studio, he was making pictures using this wonderful costume collection that he had formed, trunks full, I would think, of rich costumes of all kinds, some of which we saw in the self-portraits today. I bet that some of those portraits, whether they were self-portraits or so-called tronies, that kind of not quite portrait that is one based on you, but is kind of meant to be just an exotic figure that you have a painting of. I bet those were on view in some way, because Rembrandt, so far as we know, didn't put pictures with dealers. It was not like, like Chelsea today. On the other hand, they did sell pictures right out of their studios, and that seems to be the most frequent thing. And if they sold them, they had to have some choices. And Rembrandt surely did have what would have effectively been a kind of small gallery, or certainly had some kids to run into the storeroom and bring out things that hadn't been sold yet to show to prospective clients. About how whether the gorgeous costumes would have been a selling point, not so clear. Certainly it's a selling point for his virtuosity in rendering them. And he surely had a bag of clothing that they could wear, but that's relatively rare. And you'll see in the last of these lectures, I show you two fairly ordinary citizens dressed to kill in Renaissance costumes that I bet they didn't own, but were borrowing from Rembrandt.
Well, in a related commerce question, Rhonda asks, in dollars, how much would his work sell for during his lifetime?
Yeah, well, actually, my colleague Gary Schwartz has done some mathematics. I think he found that of the paintings by Rembrandt, for which we have prices of the 17th century, the average price was, I think, something like 375 guilders. That doesn't immediately translate for us so easily. And it actually it arises with the 100 guilder print too, because we did some math there to try to satisfy someone who wanted to know how much was 100 guilders anyway. We know that a minister, for example, and a school teacher and a skilled craftsman each earned about $500 a year, 500 guilders a year. 500 guilders would multiply out to, I'm not sure exactly, what, about $60,000 or thereabouts. So if the average price was about 375 guilders, we know that, for example, each of the militiamen in the group portrait called the Night Watch, which we'll see, each one of them paid 100 guilders. That was on the low end, but then again, they only mostly got their head and shoulders painted. The rest could be painted by from any model. 100 guilders was a huge price for a piece of paper, but it wouldn't buy you a Rembrandt portrait of yourself. That would cost you more in the order of 300 or 400, even 500 guilders, and way more if you were portrayed, as few were portrayed from head to foot, full length.
And you said in a prior lecture that people would come in for maybe one sitting. I would imagine them coming in for days and days and days, but what was a typical sitting like?
I bet, well, we don't know exactly. We know that one day Rembrandt surely was able to paint a head, or at least paint it to a point where he had the structure and had observed the key things in it. He might not have finished it entirely. And what I said in that lecture was that we know that he got his sitters to leave behind the parts that he didn't need to paint on the spot, like the ruff they wear, or the collar, the cuffs that they had, and so forth. So he could paint them later, or he could get somebody to paint them later. He surely used studio hands, the more experienced of his pupils, to help bring the portrait along. But how much that happened, we don't know for sure. And in what cases he did that, we don't know. Some portraits were clearly not only started by, but finished by Pupils and signed by Rembrandt. But that
Do you
was
think
the Guild
do you think
allowed him
those
to do.
do you think those studio assistants also acted as sort of stand-in models, like
Yeah, I
the
do.
business person would leave and then they
I
would stand
do.
there and
I,
pose?
I do, Claudia. I think that's exactly how it must have worked with the whole massive people, 30 odd people coming out of the under the city gate. That's a tremendous tour de force of organization and painting a large number of people. And I don't think that they stood there to have to be painted. I think they were probably posed in groups and then painted. The heads, I think, must have been added. And then probably surely Rembrandt went at certain areas of costume where only he could have given it that sort of luster or uh, beautifulness of surface that he could apply.
We have an interesting question from Giselle. Why did he sign his early works in Latin?
People did things in Latin. They went to school in Latin. They read and could even speak Latin. So to call yourself Rembrandt Harmensis Leidensis, RHL, was part of an old tradition going back well into the Italian Renaissance and earlier of having a Latin name and using it in signature form. He later dropped that and just used his own single name, Rembrandt. There was an exhibition, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, called When Rembrandt Became Rembrandt. When the Rembrandt we know stopped giving his patronymic and his town of origin and just took on one name. That's what Raphael did in the previous century. It's what Dürer did. And the artists that he wanted to belong to the lineage of used a single name. And so I hope that answers Giselle's question.
Yeah, a trend that continues today,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
pop star universe at least.
Yeah.
Um, so Carmen says that she's been to an exhibition by Nicholas Mays, a pupil of Rembrandt's, and wonders if you have any thoughts about how his work compares with Rembrandt's, and can you talk about Rembrandt's influence on other painters?
Perfectly timed question, because in the 6th lecture in this series, you're going to see Nicholas Maas, as he said, Nicholas Maas, head to head with Rembrandt, painting the same sitter. And you can decide. A big change happened in portrait painting in particular around the middle of the century. And you will hear more about that in the next 2 lectures, towards a lighter and brighter and clearer style, less mysterious, you could say, less richly painted, more, how to say, available and clear. And you'll see how Rembrandt navigated that, mostly by going straight ahead. But while his pupils, 15, 20 years younger than he, prospered in the new style, which is heavily influenced by painting styles in France at the same time. By middle of the century, the dominant mode in practiced by Nicholas Maas and other artists soon after, was this clearer, more, we'd say, elegant and legible painting style, particularly in portraiture.
And related, Barbara asks, how were these small portraits and etchings displayed by their owners?
We have very few that have come down in their original frames, but those that have are generally in fairly thin, fairly narrow ebony bands. But there are also some small pictures that have built up frames, meaning built up by moldings, one on top of the other or in one within another, to make effectively kind of not quite shadow boxes, but surroundings that have some substance. Almost, I think, invariably, these were dark. These were either brown, dark brown, or black, ebony being being lustrous black.
It reminds me of a story I once read about Greta Garbo at home in New York City. I think she lived in the Dakota building, and the interviewer had gone to her home, and she had a lot of tiny paintings, but she had them hidden around her house, like behind curtains or where you'd come across them by accident. And she wanted you to just sort of be delighted and surprised when you came across them, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, well,
I doubt a Rembrandt owner would do that, though.
yeah, I don't know about that. I doubt it. I think the opposite. I think you'd want them right out where you could see them. I think they were not, Dutch owners were proud and, if not ostentatious.
Hilde van Neck-Joer asks about a drawing of Rembrandt called Rembrandthuis of Rembrandt as an artist, and she wants to know if it's by Rembrandt or by a pupil.
You'd have to repeat what she said the title is, please.
She says that it's a drawing that's in the Rembrandthuis of Rembrandt. A portrait of, I can't understand it. Maybe Hilda, you could retype it so we can read this more clearly. Here's a sort of interesting forensic use of the fact that Rembrandt had made so many self-portraits. KP says that there's a scientist who took all these hundreds of self-portraits and tried to reproduce Rembrandt's voice by analyzing his portraits and virtually simulating what his skull and vocal organs, what kind of sound they would have produced and what his voice would have sounded like from the paintings and drawings. Did you hear of that?
I missed that. If I could have a reference, I'd be really grateful. I'd love to hear his voice.
That's pretty wild.
There is a filmmaker who took all the self-portraits and superimposed them, or I should say in sequence, so that the eyes were always in the same place, which is a little difficult because he moved his head, of course. But anyway, had the eyes always in the same place, and then showed a series, I think, of quite rapid dissolves, all those images as he went from a 23-year-old to an old man. And apparently it's very remarkable. I've never been able to find it and see it. So.
Oh, well, if anybody out there,
yes, out there,
in the 21 countries that are watching right now, if anybody knows where this video exists, we'd all love to see it. So maybe you could paste a link in the chat or email it to info@hammer.ucla.edu.
There may be a reference to it, if I remember right. There's a wonderful book, by the way, on Rembrandt's. There's a number of books on Rembrandt's self-portrait. The one that I would recommend you get, if you can, is called Rembrandt by Himself. And it's the catalog of an exhibition that was held in the Mauritshuis in The Hague and in London at the National Gallery in 1999. So it's not that old. And there were plenty of copies. And the last one I last saw, they're in the antiquarian book market. So that means you can get them online. Rembrandt by Himself. The author credit, it was Christopher White and Quentin Buvelot, B-U-V-E-L-O-T, Quentin Buvelot. Rembrandt by Himself. And I think there's a reference in that book to what that film is. There you go.
That reminds me of, that John was kind enough to provide an entire list of books that he recommends about Rembrandt for those of you in the audience who would like to read more about Rembrandt and maybe study some of these images more closely. And the list of books he recommends is on the Hammer website on the Rembrandt Here and Now page, so you can check it out there. Let's see. We have a few other questions. One, it's a little psychoanalysis of Rembrandt. Do you feel that Rembrandt respected his artistic skills, or did he just see it as a means to make money? And if it was just in pursuit of making money, could that be part of his melancholy?
Oh, great. Did he suffer as a result? I don't think I'm saying too much, even though we don't have anything like an autobiography. Not saying too much to say that he must have been enormously proud. of the way he painted. He presented himself with these self-portraits, I think in part, not just to give collectors a record of what he looked like, but to show them and their guests how he painted as a demonstration of just how subtly and richly he could paint a face and how alive he could make a face look, how much of the inner life can be seen from just paint on the surface. So he has to have been proud. He lived well and he made plenty of money while it lasted, and he spent even more, which ended up putting him in very difficult circumstances in the later 1650s, and going effectively bankrupt during that period. So he went up and came down financially, but I don't think for a minute he lost any pride, and I certainly don't think he felt remorseful about the money he had made while he was making it.
The voice reconstruction, Rembrandt's voice reconstruction, someone has actually pasted a link to that in the chat. So for those of you who would like to listen to it, check out the chat, and I will email it to you, John, also.
Thank you.
And now, speaking of Rembrandt and overspending and being broke all the time, I was lucky enough to visit his home in Amsterdam, one of them at least. And one of the coolest things I saw there was they had someone who reconstructed how he made his pigments. And I was just absolutely entranced. Do you want to talk at all about pigments? I find that whole process fascinating.
Amazing, isn't it? I mean, you didn't buy them. You certainly didn't buy paint out in a tube. You made your own, and you made it by buying the minerals from people who sold such stuff, buying the minerals, hunks, chunks, and this and that, and you brought them back, or your studio hand brought them back, and the kind of low end of the art game was the young men, they were always males, who ground the pigments and who ground them. It was very important to get them to the right degree of friability, or whatever you call that, sort of dustiness, or get them down to where they would do the work without getting muddy. And so we have images of artists at work, and in the background, these grunts are grinding away. You didn't go out, well, you probably went out and bought the various drying oils that were for sale. I'm sure they were for sale. You didn't have to mix up but you did have to mix up your own paint. And I don't know what you saw particularly. Did they show you a demonstration, Claudia, when you were at the Rembrandt house?
Yeah, they were grinding the pigment, and then they had the linseed oil and maybe some other oil, and they mixed it up on a palette. And
yeah. Every day it had to be done, and then you would scrape it off and start all over again. I mean, you could mix up a fair batch of paint, but you have to scrape off everything you didn't use and start over again every day. And
did he have special colors that he made, like Titian did, or was
he had the same palette, really essentially the same palette, meaning the range of different colors made from different pigments, some of them mineral, some of them vegetable, meaning dyestuffs, and some of them are insanely expensive, like the blues that were used in the most expensive. Rembrandt didn't use so much of that. Rembrandt's palette is well known, has been studied up and down, and it was used by his pupils too, and it was generally not anything very different from most artists of the 17th century, but it was all hand done. We didn't have paint in tubes, did we, until the middle of the 19th century.
And all of those handmade paints were very, very stable, right? Because have they changed color over time, or is it just the shellacking that goes over them that changes color?
Yeah, well, stable, yes. Not all equally impervious to light, so that ultraviolet light can change colors. It's particularly damaging to some pigments and not to others. Yellows, for example, are apt to be fugitive. Um, yeah, and here's the darkening business, and this very much affects Rembrandt's work. You have paint that was laid on top of a kind of red-brown ground, and the paint goes on and completely covers and shows maybe a little bit through, that is, the dark shows a little bit through, gives an overall tone to the picture. The artist then will usually varnish very thinly in such a way that you get the maximum. The paint doesn't go dull. That it is transparent varnish allows the contrasts and the colors to be true completely. What changes is that the paint itself changes what the physicists call its refractive index. It becomes more translucent, which means that the ground that it's painted on becomes more visible, which means that it gets darker. Not in an overallly not in a way that is even across the spectrum, so that whites tend to stay white, whereas other colors get darker as a result. And also the varnish that gets put on the painting last by the artist turns yellow, slowly, gradually, but turns yellow and darkens somewhat. And that has been, for centuries, one of the main problems of restorers of paintings. They've got to remove the discolored varnish and replace it with transparent varnish, which they don't always do gently enough so that the paint can come off as well as the varnish if one isn't careful. And lots of restorers were not very careful for a long, long time, from Rembrandt's time until our own. So paintings as a rule, generally speaking, of Rembrandt have darkened somewhat to very much over the years. And I've shown you also examples that were quite yellow because the museums choose not to remove the yellow varnish, being afraid that they'll not only make a glaring change to the appearance of the picture, but they may take off some original paint. And that is so the reason why when you go to Dresden or to the museum, the Hermitage in Petersburg, you'll see a lot of yellow Rembrandts.
So for the ones where it's not yellowish from the varnish, would you say they're very different from what they looked like in their time? Or the ones that have been restored, are we getting a pretty good representation of what they would have looked like?
You can't really restore the color balance. You can, that is the dark light balance.
When I say restored, I mean like the varnish, revarnished.
Sure. Dealers always had a way of cleaning a painting so that you didn't get bright whites by leaving some dirty varnish on or compensating in various nefarious ways. That those methods were discredited, but they did have something to say for themselves aesthetically. I think we're now in a very good period where we understand way better than ever before just how careful you have to be. And I think we understand better that certain changes are irreversible. It really cannot be restored. And those generally have to do with the relative light and dark balance in the picture and just the unfixable darkening of whole areas of paintings, except all 17th century paintings now that are painted on a dark ground, which is almost all of them, have the same problem to greater or lesser degree. I could be talking about Italian paintings as well.
We have another question related to that, but before I read that one, I want to say that A and Joanne have both posted videos of the self-portrait layering.
Fantastic.
So for those of you who can see the links in the chat, the video that John was talking about it's now been found thanks to the miracle of crowdsourcing. Thanks to all of
Wow.
you out there.
Yeah, thank you.
And John will send you that shortly as well.
Thank you.
Um, Now, Margaret asks if he ever painted in egg tempera.
No.
Okay, good to know. And we figured out Hilda's question. I'm going to go back to Hilda. She says, you showed a drawing of Rembrandt in work clothes that's in the Rembrandt House Museum. I thought that was by a pupil, or is it by Rembrandt?
I now don't know which picture she's talking about. Sorry.
It's okay. We can move on. Actually, we're almost done. We're kind of out of time for questions. I have to say that I am very eager. I've never seen that Charles Laughton biopic of Rembrandt, but I love Charles Laughton films, so
You see it.
that might be my Sunday night
You see it.
pleasure. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
And I think that we'll wrap it up. Do you have any last words before we go until next week, or you want to give us a little shout out about what's going to happen next week?
No, please come back. Please come back. The good stuff now starts.
All right.
If you weren't happy before, the last two lectures have the later work, and it's pretty dizzy.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear you talk about the Hammers Juno painting, which is just utterly spectacular. So you can RSVP on the Hammer Museum website, and we will see you next Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a great